Welcome to the Explainer. Today we're looking at something that is genuinely a game changer for childhood anxiety. We're going to explore how those very digital worlds we're constantly worrying or just distracting our kids might actually hold the secret to building their mental resilience. Yep, we are talking about the absolute power of therapeutic gamification. Look, if you're a parent, a teacher, or a mental health professional, you already know the drill. It is an exhausting struggle. You know exactly what it's like trying to get an anxious kid to practice traditional exposure therapy. Getting them to just do their regular math homework is a battle, right? But therapy homework, they're terrified, they dig their heels in, and honestly, the assignments feel like this massive, overwhelming chore. And we really can't blame them. We're literally asking them to purposefully confront the exact things that terrify them the most. And the stakes for figuring out this engagement problem, they're incredibly high. Based on developmental epidemiology research, almost a third, 31.9% to be exact, of adolescents experience an anxiety disorder at some point between the ages of 13 and 18. That is a massive, urgent issue. We desperately need better, more engaging tools to reach these kids before those childhood fears solidify into lifelong struggles. So let's dive right into this. We're going to break it all down into 6 quick steps. We'll start with the engagement problem, reveal the secret weapon of gamification, compare regular gaming to therapy, look at the hard clinical evidence from the MindLight trials, understand what the meta-analysis tells us about the results, and finally look at real-world applications happening as we speak. Okay, starting off with part 1, the therapy engagement problem, and how we battle that tricky dropout rate. So think of traditional cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, like a heavy, formidable sword. It is highly effective. It's the gold standard for fighting anxiety, really. But for an anxious kid, it's often just way too heavy to pick up. The core of exposure therapy is habituation, and that means repetition is absolutely required. A child has to repeatedly face a feared stimulus until their brain finally clicks and learns, oh, okay, this is safe. But kids naturally have a super high resistance to clinical settings. To them, sitting in a therapist's office is boring at best and terrifying at worst. What they desperately need is a safe, intrinsically motivating environment where they actually want to practice these scary skills. Which brings us to part 2, gamification, our secret weapon. We're really framing gamification here not as some cheap distraction, but as an absolute clinical superpower. By definition, gamification in therapy is applying game design elements, things like points, leveling up, narrative arcs, and immediate feedback loops to transform proven clinical techniques into something a kid actually wants to engage with. Think of it as a clinical Trojan horse. It essentially takes that bitter, tough pill of exposure therapy and wraps it up perfectly inside the sweet, irresistible, and totally familiar exterior of a video game. And this brilliantly illustrates how we translate all that dense, intimidating clinical jargon directly into mechanics that kids intuitively get. Cognitive restructuring, that becomes detective thinking, or an epic in-game thought battle. A terrifying exposure hierarchy simply turns into leveling up with progressive difficulty. Relaxation techniques become calm-down superpowers. And positive reinforcement? Well, that's the points, the badges, and the awesome unlockable content that keeps them coming back for more. Moving on to part 3, regular gaming versus therapy. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Wait, isn't all this just more screen time rotting kids' brains? Well, we need to dismantle that myth right now. Regular gaming focuses primarily on pure entertainment and extrinsic fun. Therapeutic gaming, on the other hand, is purpose-built from the ground up to target causal psychological processes. Now, it's actually worth noting that researchers found even commercial games, like one called Max and the Magic Marker, showed some anxiety-reducing benefits literally just by rewarding kids for persevering through failure. Pretty cool, right? But therapeutic games go so much deeper by directly integrating clinical biofeedback and exposure. What's really fascinating here is how this science works under the hood. When you map out the neuropsychology, you see how in-game tasks, like incremental challenges and goal setting, feeds straight up into cognitive control and executive functioning. Meanwhile, things like role-playing and relaxation training feed directly into stress response modulation and emotional regulation. It is a highly structured neuropsychological workout, but to the kid, it's totally disguised as play. Let's jump into part 4, the MindLight RCT evidence. Of course, as parents and educators, theory is all well and good, but we need hard proof before we just hand a tablet to an anxious child. Well, the most prominent example in the literature is a game called MindLight, and this isn't your average app. It's actually a neurofeedback game. Players wear an actual EEG headset that reads their brainwaves while they navigate a spooky mansion. To succeed, kids must actively use relaxation techniques. If they manage to stay calm, the mind light on their character's head shines bright, and it literally turns scary monsters into friendly animals. It practically forces them to actively practice emotional regulation just to win the game. And the randomized controlled trial results, they are phenomenal. After measuring baseline anxiety, researchers had kids play MindLight for just 5 total hours. That was broken down into 1-hour sessions twice a week. That's it, just 5 hours. The result? Immediate post-test reductions in anxiety, and incredibly, at a 3-month follow-up, those anxiety reductions were completely maintained. The researchers actually found these results were equivalent to a traditional cognitive behavioral therapy prevention program. Imagine that, 5 hours of play matching weeks of clinical therapy. Which leads us to part 5, modest but meaningful results. But hey, let's take a breath and ground our enthusiasm for a second. We're dealing with science, and we need to look at the broader reality check across the entire field of gamified health. A really comprehensive 2024 meta-analysis published in JAMA Pediatrics looked at all these gaming interventions. They concluded that they produce, and I quote, modest but significant effects on anxiety outcomes, with stronger effects for interventions grounded in established therapeutic frameworks. So, to be super clear, this isn't some instant magical cure-all that's going to erase severe clinical anxiety overnight. The clinical effects on paper are modest to moderate. But, and this is a huge but, the crucial point is understanding why a modest clinical effect is actually a massive win in the real world. The true victory here is engagement. Remember, we're dealing with a pediatric population that famously drops out of traditional therapy because it's just too scary or too boring. If a child plays a therapeutic game, they are actually doing the work. When kids actively want to engage with their therapy, even a modest effect size translates into a completely life-changing victory for a struggling family. Finally, part 6, real-world application with fearmenotapp. So how do we actually take this out of the academic labs and put it into the hands of kids today? An app called fearmenotapp is a fantastic example. It takes CBT and gamifies the whole shebang. First, it turns terrifying exposure tasks into brave missions, where confronting fear is literally just how you advance to the next level. Second, it uses variable ratio rewards. Those are the exact same psychological hooks used in highly addictive video games, but here they're used to keep motivation to practice incredibly high. And third, it uses brilliant narrative framing. With a brand voice of "don't calm down, conquer," it reframes the child not as a patient, but as the absolute hero of their own epic story. Let's see how this approach builds depending on a kid's developmental stage. Because, you obviously can't give a teenager the same game as a toddler. For toddlers ages 3 to 4, gamification relies heavily on simple cause and effect and immediate touch and reward mechanics. For school-age kids, say 7 to 9, they absolutely thrive on points, badges, and treating fear hierarchies as game levels. But for teens, they need autonomy. They need self-tracking dashboards and much more subtle gamification that totally respects their maturity while still tracking their progress. Which leaves us with this final perspective-shifting question to chew on. We spend so much energy worrying about our kids' screen time, right? But what if, when purposefully designed with clinical science, the screen time you worry about most is actually the psychological shield they need to finally conquer their fears? The science shows us that when we meet kids where they already are, in the engaging world of play, we can help them level up their mental health for life. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really encourage you to explore the incredible world of therapeutic gamification further.